Welcome, everyone. I'm Debbie Liu. I'm the Associate Director of eSig, and I wanted to welcome you to this special webinar. So for those of you who are not familiar with eSig, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization. We provide our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of clean energy and energy systems integration decisions. And we do this through workshops, through tutorials, through webinars like this, through blogs, working groups, and task force activities, and we produce technical resource materials. eSig also serves in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST, which convenes key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. eSig leads one of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. And more information on that can be found at www.globalpst.org. Now, regarding logistics for today's webinar, all the participant lines will be muted. If you have a question, please go to slido.com, enter ESIG17, ESIG17 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. There will be a thumbs up button next to questions. You can cast a vote. That'll help prioritize questions submitted. You won't be able to ask questions through WebEx. Please go to slido.com. And we'll save time to answer the questions on Slido at the end of the presentation. And we'll send out an email with a link once the video file has been posted. And we'll plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. So today, we're going to be talking about generator interconnection, and the recent FERC-NOPR on generator interconnection is probably at the top of everyone's mind. Interconnection forum being discussed at the ISOs. We just held last week a 3-day online workshop examining various aspects of generator interconnection. You can view those presentations on our YouTube channel if you missed it. We have a proactive planning task force that's been analyzing generator interconnection to quantify the benefits of being proactive. And Bruce Tsuchida of the Brattle group led this analysis with support from the Interconnection study team and detailed input from MISO and SPP staff. And Bruce is going to be presenting an examination of 3 levels of proactiveness and generator interconnection using the MISO and SPP regions as test beds. Bruce is a principal of the Brattle group. He's got 30 years of experience in power generation development, utility operation, and power market analysis. And I'd like to turn it over now to Bruce to do the webinar. Thanks.
Used by now, so it's been a while since we started working on renewable integration. It was the time when it was called UWIG, and then turned into UVIG, and then eSig, and so on and so forth. Today, as Debbie said, I'd like to talk about how proactive planning for generation interconnection can potentially help, and help can mean in different ways. But the focus for today is how would it help reduce the interconnection costs for the generators. This study was developed in conjunction with the eSig Proactive Planning Task Force that Debbie just introduced. We did the study as a between Brattle and Interconnection, who is also another eSig member for a long time, to come up with the study. And please remember, this study is just to kind of showcase what would happen if you take SPP and MISO as an example. It's not meant to be a substitute for any of the studies that SPP and MISO engineers and staff will have to take. It's more of an illustrative example using real data to show the magnitude of impact or benefits rather than precise needs. So the study, as Debbie said, looks at 3 levels of proactiveness in planning the generation interconnection. By proactiveness, we are trying to figure out if expanding the number of projects that the ISOs, RTOs, or utilities analyze through their clustering process will help. And in order to expand the number of GI requests to study through the different studies, we said, okay, the current approach is that you perform GI studies on an annual basis using all the generator interconnection queues that were requested in that year and run the GI studies. The cluster studies can be one for the entire region or can be for sub-regions. But in any case, the RTOs and ISOs and many utilities do the cluster study on an annual basis, sometimes on a semi-annual basis. So what we also did was we said, okay, instead of doing it on an annual or perhaps semi-annual basis, what happens if you take multiple years? So looking at the generation interconnection today, what happens if we do the cluster study looking at projects that for the next 3 years rather than next single year? And would that actually help? Because it technically increases the number of projects that you're studying through the cluster study. And if there's economies of scale and scope of the interconnection upgrade needs, then it should technically reduce the cost on a per kilowatt basis for any generation that's trying to interconnect. And then the next question is, can we go even further? What happens if we take 5 years and also combine it with other transmission enhancements? For that, we took the MISO SPP JTIQ study, which is a wonderful, wonderful study if you have not looked at it. It looks at how MISO and SPP can address the seams issue that is lacking transmission attention, and saying here are the projects that would help integrate more of the GIQs that are existing today. And so that becomes the highest level of interconnection proactiveness. So we compare these 3 levels. Obviously, throughout the presentation, you'll see the 3 shades of blue. The higher numbers or the darker shades of blue indicates a higher level of proactiveness. And we'll just call it level 1, 2, and 3. Again, as a reminder, this study is not a subsidy for any interconnection engineering study. We don't discuss cost allocation or other provisions for those cost allocation. And we are not considering any cost inefficiency caused by restudies that are common today. So with that said, here's the background. The industry trend is that more renewables are wanted. That can be because of the state RPS, or it can be because of the corporate PPAs, or it could be for other purposes. And based on a study that was done by the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that was published earlier in April 2021, as of the end of April 2022, I'm sorry. As of the end of 2021, there were over 1 terawatt of generation and almost half a terawatt of storage in the generation interconnection queue. That's about more than 8,000 active interconnection requests. Most of them are renewables. And if you compare that to 5 years ago, the total volume basically blew up by 3 times. Out of that 1,000 gigawatts, over 900 gigawatts of is from renewables, the majority being solar and followed by wind. And gas generation is kind of the remaining 7% or so. One more thing is that a huge chunk of the solar and wind that's being proposed along with storage are estimated to have in-service dates by the end of 2024. So you're effectively looking at a 3-year window at the most, maybe 4 years. And just for another comparison, the total combined peak load for the lower 48 states today, according to the NERC long-term reliability criteria, is about 760 gigawatts. So there's more than enough capacity if you don't account for the capacity value of solar and wind, but just on a pure ICAP basis, more than enough capacity to replace all the resources in the lower 48 states in the queue. That is a humongous amount, and that's probably one of the reasons that a lot of the RTOs are struggling with the interconnection queue process. But at the same time, it is a change in the industry where a lot of states and a lot of local jurisdiction and private entities are trying to go green and replace a lot of the traditional thermal resources with renewables, whether it's wind and solar or a combination of combined with storage. The chart on the left is exactly what it says. It just shows the total capacity and the interconnection request counts in GIQ by year. The dotted black line is the new request in a year, and the capacity is in the solid blue line. So you can see how after 2012, it's been growing exponentially. This slide is, along with that increase in generation interconnection queue, the average waiting time to get the queue request process is extending. So it used to be about 2 years. That was in the 2000 to 2000 timeframe, and now it's almost 4 years. Even within that 4 years, the average time between the interconnection request and interconnection agreement, which is the time to do the 3 interconnection studies that we'll go over in a few slides, exceeded 3 years. And part of this is because of excess projects and associated withdrawals. The current policy basically allows people to submit multiple interconnection requests so that they can identify which one best suits them. And because of that, when projects do withdraw, there's a need for restudies, because then all of a sudden the transmission solution or the interconnection needs that the RTOs and ISOs identified are no longer valid because some projects are not there. With all that said, only about a quarter of the projects in the queue actually reach commercial operations, and that success rate is even lower for solar and wind. This all led to a huge surge in interconnection queue requests. As we know, many of the RTOs are trying to remedy that backlog right now. PJM, as an example, recently proposed to pause their mostly solar 1,200 projects for the next 3 years. MISO and SPP and other RTOs are also reviewing their process. SPP, for example, have changed their process from doing a semi-annual study to doing an annual study to catch up with all the interconnection requests. So what is this interconnection process that we're talking about? The current generation interconnection process was established about 20 years ago in FERC Order 2003. Coincidentally, it was established in July 2003. In those days, almost all new interconnection generators were natural gas fueled, whether it's a combined cycle or a simple cycle. And the policy allowed gas fuel generation to select interconnection points. So the idea was, well, there's ample transmission, so let them figure out where they want to connect, because depending on the location, the LMPs will differ, and that will be impacted by the transmission congestion and whatnots. And gas fuel generation, as long as you have water and gas, it's relatively free to connect to anywhere where it is, compared to, let's say, wind, where it's heavily location constrained. Just because you move the wind from one location to another location does not mean that you're going to get the same performance, while on a gas generation, that is possible. Wind and solar to some extent on another way is really location constrained. You will get higher wind in, let's say, western Nebraska, but not so much in New York City. So there's a preferred location for renewables. The current GI process requires 3 interconnection studies to be performed on a first-come, first-served basis, although the recent FERC NOPR suggested a first-ready, first-served basis approach. Also, some of the RTOs, for example, New York, already incorporates a first-come, first-served basis, and many of the RTOs have, in response to the ANOPR and potential NOPR, have alluded that they're going to move to the first-come, first-served basis. Now, in that process, many of the RTOs will apply a cluster study approach, meaning studying multiple projects at once to kind of shorten the study period, but also to lower the interconnection cost, because interconnecting 2 projects is, on a unit level, supposedly cheaper than doing just one. But in the meantime, the transmission system has become oversubscribed. And one of the problems is that renewable resources can be built much quicker. Wind can take anywhere between months to a few years. Solar can be counted in weeks to months. Gas fuel generation takes about 3 years. Transmission can take 5 to 10 years. So there's clearly a lag. And also, the other thing is renewables are typically built in remote locations far from the load center, and they can also be scaled easier, and they take advantage of the economies of scale. So when you're building bigger assets that are further away from the load, you tend to require more transmission capacity for longer distances, aggravating the issue. One more thing about renewables is that there's actually both transmission planning and generation interconnection will help facilitate renewables, but there's a gap. The gap is in two ways. First is that the purpose. Generation interconnection studies are there to identify the least cost upgrades, and it typically focuses on the short term, up to 5 years. On the other hand, long-term transmission planning are looking at the largest net benefits, not necessarily the least cost, but the largest net benefits, and they look at 10 to 20 years. Now, the recent NOPR, the FERC NOPR suggested everyone look into 20 years, but that's what's going on today. It may change. And so on the one hand, you got the least cost option looking at the near term. On the other hand, you have the long-term option looking at the largest net benefits. So the two are not necessarily aligned. But building additional transmission is crucial to supporting continued growth of renewables. And there are successful examples like the MISO MVP project. Recently, a second version of the MVP project has been approved, and MISO's probably going to be building about $10 billion worth of new transmission. SPP's double circuit 345 kV network and collector system that was built in the early 2000 timeframe through 2015 was also another success story, along with California's Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project and everyone's favorite ERCOT CREZ. So all these higher voltage networks that were built for renewables has been fully subscribed, and they were successful, but somehow we're not seeing part 2 or part 3 of those. So the question that we're trying to address is, will a more proactive GI approach that helps fill in the gap between GI studies and transmission studies, and would that help, and by how much? So what we looked at, because there's multiple ways of measuring proactiveness, is how can the proactiveness of the study window or time or the number of projects that the cluster study looks into at any given time help, along with would expanding the GI study scope help? That is the background of the study. To do so, what we did, we compare 3 levels of proactive GI planning. Level 1, the lowest level of proactive planning, is what we do today. The RTOs and ISOs and utilities study the GI on an annual basis. So as an illustrative example, if you take a look at SPP, which does it on a semi-annual basis, every cycle they have about 1,000 to 5,000 megawatts of interconnection projects. And they take that and study it, although SPP splits them into different zones. So every zone will have maybe 1,000 megawatts or more. Now, the next question is, what's the next level? So what we did was we said, okay, what happens if we look at 3 years of studies? So rather than looking at a single year, we said, okay, we have perfect foresight, and obviously perfect foresight helps, but we have perfect foresight to the projects that are coming online in the next 3 years, and study or create do a cluster study for projects that covers 3 years. Again, in the case of SPP, that's about 15,000 megawatts. Now that's for SPP as a whole, which is about, a multiplier of level 1, where you're doing that on an annual or semi-annual basis. The third question is, okay, what happens if we expand that to 5 years and further add additional transmission enhancements? The MISO JTIQ study that we'll heavily refer to in this study is effectively doing that. It's looking at how much renewables or generation interconnection queue it can accommodate in parallel to doing what's equivalent to an effective system study. The effective system study is an RTO doing the interconnection study for its neighboring system, saying, hey, I know I can integrate this this much renewables or whatever some GIQ in my interconnection process, but will it affect my neighboring system? Will there be loop flows? How will that happen? And would that actually be detrimental for the neighboring system, or would it be okay for them? So the JTIQ study that we talked about effectively does that in parallel to figuring out how much additional GI it can establish. In that case, they looked at about 40,000 megawatts plus afterwards. So you can see how the group or the number of GI or the capacity of GIs that are being coordinated increases as we go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. And we're not saying that we're going to wait, for example, for level 2. We're not going to be waiting 3 years to do the study. We're just saying, what are the what are the projects that are lined up today for the next 3 years? And this makes a lot of sense in the sense that most of the GIs are renewables, and renewables are very, very location specific, as I said earlier. So even if a project decides to withdraw, some other project will come in at the same location and potentially put in a new project at the same location. So it's not like the studies will be wasted. One more thing is, if you look at the ERCOT CREZ, the SPP priority projects, the MISO MVPs, and the California TANCHAB that I introduced in the previous slides, those guys are fully subscribed. And so the concern that if you build ahead, maybe no one will sign up later and there's going to be stranded costs is probably overrated. So the MISO SPP JTIQ study. The JTIQ study was aimed at building transmission network upgrades that addresses the shortage in transmission at the MISO SPP seams. And the project or the study identified the seven projects that you see on the right-hand map. As you can see, most of them are pretty close to the MISO SPP border. It analyzes two horizons, 5 years ahead and 10 years ahead. Our study, focuses on the 5 years window so that we can compare 1 year, 3 year, and 5 years. And what the JTIQ study identified was the 7 studies that will cost a total of $1.65 billion. And that allows 28.6 gigawatts of new GI projects. This assumes energy resource interconnection services, not the capacity or network resource interconnection services. So with that in mind, we analyzed level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is the current status, and level 2 is the 3-year study, assuming everything is on an E-race basis so that we can compare it side by side. So what did we do? We first had to identify the area region to analyze. As you could have guessed, we chose the MISO and SPP region just because the JTIQ study was finalized in February and early March when we started this study, and it served as a very good example of a higher level of proactiveness. For level 1 and level 2, we also wanted to narrow down the focus area, because otherwise the study could have blown up in terms of size and scope. So we purposely selected with consultation with the task force, including SPP and MISO staff, to analyze Eastern Nebraska as a representation for SPP and Eastern Dakotas as a representation for MISO. So in level 1, we looked at the existing GI studies to figure out what the normalized as in dollar per kW interconnection cost was. In level 2, we selected the projects that you see circled in blue in the on the right-hand side maps. That adds up to about 1,000 megawatts from Eastern Nebraska and 2,300 megawatts from Eastern Dakotas. And said, if these aren't in the queue, and this is again 3 years worth of interconnection requests, if these guys are in the queue, how would you develop your transmission solution for interconnection? And for that, we analyzed the base case and N-1 assessments. That's very, very much in line with what the RTOs do for the ERIS system. And we utilized the MISO SPP generic cost estimates to tally the costs for the solutions that we developed. Now, given the sensitivity of the information here, we're not going to be able to share the details with the audience in general, but we did share the analysis results with the MISO and SPP engineers, and they looked okay. Level 3, the highest level of proactiveness, we'll just use the JTIQ study results, and we will calculate and compare the normalized GI costs among the 3 different levels. So when you compare level 1 and level 2, we're comparing the potential benefits of multiple year planning versus single year planning. So the level 2 is 3 years, level 1 is a single year. Level 2 to level 3 is the potential difference in multiple year, that's 3 versus 5 years, and also the additional benefits of the scope and study of the JTIQ, which is, as I said earlier, very, very similar to the AFS study, looking at how the interconnection process could impact your neighboring systems. And another way of saying it, SPP and MISO did a very nice job inter-regional studies of the transmission lines that are needed to help both sides of the border. So here's the study results. By looking at SPP cluster studies, the SPP cluster study for 2018 was not available at the time. SPP in their 2017 cluster added about 5,000 megawatts. The cost was about $550 million. So the average cost on a dollar per kW basis was about $109. On the other hand, MISO, we were able to look at 2017 and 2018 two-year studies worth of it. That had about another 5,000 megawatts added for 633 million. So the average cost was about $126 per kilowatt. On average, that's about $117 per kilowatt. Now, level 2, SPP multiple year clusters. Again, we looked at approximately 1,000 megawatts of new projects in the eastern Nebraska region. That's why the numbers are smaller than the SPP cluster up front, because we're just focusing on one specific region within SPP and assuming that that's a good representation of the entire SPP. MISO, similarly, we looked at roughly 2,300 megawatts of new additions in the eastern Dakotas. The cost is, as you see on the table, $91 million for SPP and $226 million for MISO. So they both come to a bit shy of $100 per kW. So between level 1 and level 3, just by expanding the scope of the cluster studies, you're seeing a 16% cost reduction from, on average, $117 per kW to $98 or less than $100 per kW. Now, if you look at the JTIQ that looks at 5-year studies, the JTIQ study, as I said earlier, has a $1.6 billion investment that enabled 28.6 gigawatts. So that reduces the average dollar per kW GI cost down to $60. So you're seeing another 33% reduction from level 2 or from compared to level 1. It's effectively halving the cost. Now, one thing about the JTIQ study is that it has identified production cost savings before adding any renewables. The 7 transmission projects that the JTIQ study evaluated resulted in nearly $1 billion of adjusted production cost savings. That's before adding any new generators from the queue. And so if you think that there's a way of allocating that $1 billion to the generators that are enabling it, the interconnection cost actually goes down to less than $25 or an 80% discount from what it was today. Now that requires a little bit more than simply saying, okay, let's go that way, because right now there's no real good allocation mechanism to allow that. And there's also it's kind of mixing apples and pears in a certain way, because JTIQ looks at both the AFS study or an interregional transmission study along with the interconnection study, but it shows how effective it is. And it also shows how the JTIQ-like approach can fill in the gap that we observed between the current GI process and the long-term transmission studies. Now, what do the results look like? This page basically summarizes in Word what we discussed about in the previous page, but MISO and SPP level 1, we're looking at a number of 37 interconnecting projects for MISO and 177 interconnecting projects for SPP. The average is about $100+, 117 on average. Level 2, if we extend the GI study window from 1 to 3 years, that reduces the cost by about 16%. Level 3, if we take JTIQ as a prime example of proactive planning, that fills in the gap between transmission expansion and GI studies. It lowers the interconnection cost down to 58, half of what it used to be. And if you include the adjusted production cost savings, it basically gives you a 80% discount on what it used to be today. That's pretty much what I summarized in the previous slide. And if you put it in a graphic, you can see that the benefits or the cost reduction is not linear. It grows as you go from the left-hand side of the 1 year to the right-hand side of 5 years. Now, even if you don't account for the JTAQ APC benefits, it's still a significant reduction because you're effectively reducing the interconnection cost into half. But overall, what the study shows is that the JTAQ-like proactive approach is really beneficial for both the interconnection customer and the load, because even if the interconnection customers cannot benefit from the $1 billion adjusted production cost savings, their interconnection cost goes down to half. Now, if there's a way to split the benefit of that adjusted production cost savings, that would be even better. And furthermore, it's by looking at that, you see how ridiculous it is to assume that the interconnection customers have to carry all the cost of it, because between the interconnection and the adjusted production cost savings, at least in the JTIQ study case, the adjusted production cost saving is a lot larger than the interconnection benefits. So that just shows how discoordinated the current process is. And then we added a little bit of a qualitative assessment. Part of this was because we anticipated that some folks may want to use this study as a reference when they respond back to the FERC GI NOPR. So the overall theme here is that proactive generation interconnection planning can help bridge the gap that we see between the short-term GI studies looking at the least cost options, looking only at 1 to 5 years, and the long-term planning studies that in the recent NOPR FERC suggested that they look at 20 years at a minimum. But again, the long-term transmission plan studies are looking at the net benefits, not the least cost. So the study shows that proactiveness can not only reduce the GI cost, but it can also help fill in the gap. One caveat is that the study shows a nonlinear reduction in GI cost as you go from 3 years to 5 years. But that may not always be true, because if you recall in the earlier slides, we showed that many of the interconnection requests in service date is within the next 3 to 4 years, or at least less than 5 years. So if that's the case, it may not make sense to extend that out for 5 years. Maybe 3 years would be a better compromise, especially if a utility or an RTO is going from the current single year, ultimately looking for a JTIQ-like study, but don't have the ability to do so in one step. In that case, going from 1 year to 2 years to 3 years may be a very good way to help reduce the backlog, but also reduce the cost for the GI customers. Now, if a cost allocation mechanism that allows latecomers to pay their share and pay back the earlier customers who paid for whatever upgrades that they were required, that would help a lot. And FERC has approved tariff provisions for, let's say, MISO and New York ISO that requires the latecomer GI customers to do so. In SPP, there's been constant arguments and discussions about since when, at what stage does a GI or generation lead line become a network, or how does that, how do people pay for that? I think there's going to be very similar discussions, especially when it comes to offshore wind, because it's ridiculous to think that you're relying on a radio line to hook up your 800 megawatt offshore wind. At some point, someone's going to say, hey, it probably makes sense to make that a network, because otherwise you're really jeopardizing reliability. And the 800 megawatts behind one single radio line can become your largest contingency, which increases your capacity reserve margin because it increases your service needs. So a policy of that kind would actually help, that allows for latecomers to pay their share. But on the other hand, as we said earlier, many of the proactive transmission projects like the SPP Double Circuit 345, the MISO MVP, ERCOT CRES have been fully subscribed and successfully integrating a large amount of renewables. So maybe that's maybe I'm worrying too much about it. So overall, if you can come up with a JTIQ-like study approach, it will certainly benefit everyone. And even if you can't go there at once, we suggest that the utilities and RTOs consider moving ahead and expanding the study scope without worrying too much about underpaying or under collection of the revenues, because in many cases, when there's a robust transmission, there's going to be more renewables coming in, and renewables are very, very location specific, meaning if someone pulls out, someone else is going to try to put in a very, very similar project at the same location. One of the things that we wanted to stress once more is that this is an illustrative study. It's focused on proactive interconnection planning benefits by evaluating multiple years instead of a single year. And we're not talking about changing the study process. We're just saying, why don't you study multiple years rather than a single year? We're not changing the graphical scope. It's not a substitute for any interconnection engineering study. And the study analyzes E-risk equivalents, so network resources interconnection may have different costs, and those costs are probably a little bit higher. We also only consider baseline scenarios, so all the analysis that we did for level 2, which is creating our own interconnection or GI upgrade needs, is only relying on traditional approaches using already used voltage lines and whatnots. We're not including grid enhancing technologies or storage or HVDC or anything that people may think it's a little bit exotic. We also say that we're assuming perfect foresight in no restudies, but as I said, 90% of the GIQ is from renewables, and renewables are likely going to be replaced with something of a similar renewable project if someone withdraws. So we're not so concerned about that at this point, although it is an issue that needs to be identified through cost allocation. And that leads us to our last box. We do not address any cost allocation or other GI issues. The purpose of the study was to see if there was benefit in proactive interconnection planning. And once we identify the benefits, as we have done here, then our thought is maybe we can then focus on a very specific system and study that system along with the cost allocation, because the cost allocation really varies by system, and it's very difficult to generalize. We didn't want that difficulty to get into the way of this generic study to show that proactive interconnection planning has benefits and will fill in the gap between transmission and GI studies. So that's where we are. And for the overall study, we're trying to figure out a way to make the study public, hopefully by the end of the month or early next month. The figure on the lower right-hand side is the table of contents. What we did was kind of go through the executive summary version of it, but the rest of the report or the deck has 4 more sections plus an appendix. Section 2, it talks about the interconnection process. So if you want to know a little bit more about the interconnection process that's prevailing today as in before the NOPR, it's in section 2. Section 3 talks about the overall industry trend, like how much renewables is coming in line, what's leading to this need for proactive planning on the GI process. And between section 2 and 3, that kind of gives you the overall background information. Section 4 talks about the study scope and analysis approach, like how many contingencies we analyze for level 2, or why we chose MISO and SPP regions and whatnots, and what the JTIQ study is all about. That will kind of give you the study analysis approach and the scope. And section 5, the last section, discusses the qualitative findings. We also include additional quantitative analysis that I briefed on earlier, but also some thoughts on the latest FERC GI NOPR in that section. Finally, the appendix includes a few glossaries and MISO and SPP backlog mitigation as a reference point, but the main parts of the report will be in the sections that I listed here. So that's it for now. And Debbie, I'll throw it back to you. We've got 20 minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce, for that very excellent presentation. So again, to the participants, please go to slido.com, type in the event code E617 and post your questions there. We've already got some questions coming in. Jovan asks, what are the key drivers for the cost savings in slide 9? Are you building different transmission for different levels or something else?
Okay, Ryan, can you put the slide back and let's go to slide 9 so that people can see. Okay, slide 9. What did, oh, next one. This is
Right,
slide
this
8.
one's 8. Can you go to the next one?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think there's economies of scale. If you're adding more projects, then you're obviously taking economies of scale as you build. That's probably the biggest one when it comes to the difference between level 1 and level 3. Remember, level 1, 5,000 megawatts for SPP and MISO are for their entire system. Level 2, the 960 and 2290 for SPP and MISO are for their subregions. So if you normalize that, you'll probably see about 15,000 megawatts worth of interconnections if you look at 3 years rather than a single year. So there's obviously economies of scale there. Now, when it comes to level 3, the JTIQ, that is the beauty of um, long-term transmission planning. MISO, if you look back, their generation interconnection queue costs went down significantly after they from the initial MVP projects, and that's because all those large high voltage lines will increase the headroom on the transmission lines. So when there's headroom, you don't have to upgrade the system. When the system is fully subscribed, every little bit of injection that you add, you have to upgrade a lot of things. So think about it this way. If there's headroom on the high voltage lines, you only need to upgrade the lower voltage lines. But when there's no headroom on the high voltage lines, your upgrade will also include those of the high voltage lines. That is a significant reduction, or that is a significant cause in the higher cost of interconnection costs, and that's what's causing it. In one of the slides in the later in the main report, we actually talk about why the big regional transmission projects have not been going forward. One of it is because the incentives the utilities have. If you have to develop a transmission line that crosses over 2 states, you have to get permission and permits for all the cities and towns and jurisdiction of both states. Furthermore, if it becomes big, FERC's preference would be that it go through a competitive procurement. On the other hand, if it's local, the utilities know their regulators very well. It does not, it's not up for competition, and they have the right of first refusal. So from the utilities perspective, they rather build local lines rather than interregional lines. And that's causing a big headache for generations because anytime they try to connect something onto the big interregional lines, it's already fully subscribed, so they have to carry the bigger charge. So that's the benefit of JTIQ, that because it's combining long-term transmission planning with the GI study, you're reducing the GI's cost significantly.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Someone's asking a clarification question. Does a 3-year study window mean you accept all applicants who have a proposed energization date within a 3-year window of each other?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. How many megawatts were included in the SPP and MISO cluster studies level 1 for the same geographic region used in the level 2 study? So I think what they're trying to get at is what's the density?
Yeah, I'll have to check that. I had the number in my head and it kind of ran away. But the question is, how many megawatts were in eastern Nebraska in level 1 and eastern Dakota in level 1? Let me get back to you on that.
Okay.
Maybe is there a way to respond to the audience afterwards?
Yeah, there will be. We'll
Okay.
Send those out to folks later. Yes.
Yeah, but I just looked at the grander picture saying what was the total for SPP and MISO, and that was the 15,000 number that I gave you earlier.
Right.
But nonetheless, we'll get back to that.
Okay. Um, did you also look at the impact of the different levels of proactiveness on queue processing times, with the more expansive studies being more or less time consuming? So they're trying to get the speediness of the queue studies. Now that, we might be clustering more, how does that affect the processing time?
We did not look at the processing time for two reasons. One is I don't know what the processing time of it is today based on the difference of the queue, and furthermore, it's very hard to compare the processing time in terms of computer time from, let's say, 2017 to 2022. So we did not look into that. We did receive a similar question from the task force when we were doing the study, but when we asked back, okay, how long does it take to do a study? They said it's all over the place, so there's no great answer for that either. So I think that's something that we can look into when we go into phase two and look at a very specific system where we do the cost allocation analysis if there is a phase two. But for phase one, we don't have that number.
Okay, thanks. How will the uncertainty of the delayed or withdrawn or additional generation affect the result? For example, the longer look ahead, the more uncertainty you have in the generators. And you sort of talked to this already, but maybe.
Yeah, so we thought about that, and obviously the withdrawals and the restudies is one big part of the whole delay. And so what we're suggesting here is that for as a first cut, let's not worry about those because again, renewables are very, very location specific, and there's preferred locations more than elsewhere than other generation types. So even if someone withdraws, someone else is going to come in. So let's not worry about that. And then furthermore, if you look at policies where FERC has approved tariffs that will allow first comers to recoup investment costs from latecomers if there's a benefit to it. And it's not only New York and MISO that I listed. PJM has something similar. New England has something similar. So it's in many RTOs that will take care of that potential overpay. And furthermore, if you're concerned about not collecting enough revenues, if you look at historical observations from the successful big projects that enabled a lot of renewables, they're all fully subscribed. So we think that that is a temporal issue, maybe a year or two. But if people see that there's ample transmission and interconnection cost is reasonable, much lower than what it is today, it's just going to be subscribed pretty easily. Because remember, we have an interconnection queue that adds up to more than replacing the entire generation asset that lives on the land today.
All right, that's a good point. It is a really sizable queue. Here's more of a clarification question. If a generator gets ERIS instead of NRIS, does it get least cost dispatched?
The least cost dispatch is common for anyone who's connected. The difference between ERIS and NRIS is whether you can qualify as capacity. So in markets where you have capacity markets like PJM New York or ISO New England, you need to have NRIS to qualify and be able to receive capacity payments. But if you're looking at markets like SPP or ERCOT where there is no capacity market, the ERIS and NRIS differentiation may not be so substantial. Now, one more thing is because the NRIS is needed to receive capacity, the choice between ERIS and NRIS will depend on your unit type. If you, for example, if you're in a market where wind is only evaluated at 20% capacity value, then you may consider is that 20% capacity value worth the additional cost to go NRIS, or should I just assume ERIS? So it's all about capacity. The least cost dispatch will not make a difference between NRIS and ERIS.
Excellent, thanks. What adjustments would be needed to apply the methods you describe to more dispersed generation, such as solar applications in PJM?
So I don't think we need anything. Uh, so just to go into the level two analysis that we did, we looked at how the RTOs do the study, and we received the power flow cases from the RTO, used the exact same criteria. For example, in MISO, MISO looks at summer and shoulder, and the capacity value or capacity factor that's assumed for the summer for solar is quite high, while that for the wind is relatively low. On the other hand, in the spring, it's reversed. So we looked at those and studied it. So those assumptions are already baked into the results. And we don't tell you which of the, for example, if you look at SPP level 2, there's 960 megawatts, and MISO, there's 2290 megawatts. Those are mostly a combination of solar and wind anyways. We just don't tell you the details because for obvious reasons. But I don't think you need to change the approach at all. It's just getting the data and doing the analysis, repeating the analysis for the specific areas and specific unit types.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. Did you notice any new high voltage network overlays as a result of different planning levels? Going from level 1 to level 3, are you, say, moving from 345 kV to 500 kV or AC to DC?
No, we initially wanted to do it on the same project basis. So, for example, if we had a basic and say, in level 1, we're going to be building these 5 plants. In level 2, we're going to be building an additional 10 plants. In level 3, we're going to be building an additional 20 plants or whatnot, so that the base is the same. But that wish was not granted because it was very hard to come up with something of that nature. So the reason that we normalized it is that the projects that we're studying in level 1 and level 2 and level 3 are not all the same. They're all different. And that's why we're only comparing the costs rather than further deciphering it and say solar cost in level 1 was what, or wind cost in level 2 was what. The error range that we observed is perhaps bigger than that level of details.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. Are the costs listed in the page 9 summary table an average? If
Yes,
this is an average cost, what is the range of costs?
it's the average. I don't have the range of costs in my mind, but I do remember that some of the higher ones went to 300 or even higher on a dollar per kW basis.
Okay, so the range can be quite large.
Yes.
Um,
But one thing is, if you look at the average between SPP and MISO, whether it's level 1 or level 2, they're miraculously close.
mhm, right.
So there's always going to be outliers, but the closeness of the two RTOs on the numbers that we calculated gave us comfort that okay, the results are relatively robust.
Right.
If one was 50 and another one was 200, and we said the average is 125, that's probably questionable, but
Mhm. How do you reconcile the expectation that new projects will replace withdrawn requests if the cost to interconnect at that point of interconnection made the project economics unsustainable? So you triggered a really expensive upgrade, and so the project withdraws, then nobody's going to want to replace them because they'll all trigger the same upgrade.
well, whether they'll trigger the same upgrade is questionable because that specific project may have withdrawn, but other projects may have gone forward. So that's a speculation that I did not make. I'm just saying if all else being equal, then someone else will come in because there's only so many good wind and so many good solar locations.
Were you triggering deep network upgrades in the process?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Um, in the process, were you finding any deep network upgrades that were triggered as part of the reliability analysis?
I think there were certain upgrades, especially in level 2, where we had to go to 230 or 345 kV additions. But when they're shared by, call it 2,000 megawatts of resources, the cost is not that prohibitive. It's actually cheaper to share a higher voltage line than each individual queue support a lower voltage line. And just as a regular rule of thumb, every time the voltage doubles, the cost doubles, but then the transfer quantity, well, the cost doesn't double. It goes up by 1.6 to 1.8 times, but the transfer capability, when the voltage doubles, goes up by 4 times. So you can see the economies of scale right there.
Mm-hmm. Um, Jovan asks if you can expand on the last row in this slide where it shows full JTIQ benefits. What do the 8 adjusted production cost benefits include, and who benefits?
That's a cost allocation issue that we did not purposely go into, because who benefits is basically saying that who gets allocated the costs and the benefits. The APC is simply saying if you added the $1.65 billion worth of 7 transmission projects, how much congestion could you reduce, and how would that impact the production cost within the footprint? And MISO and SPP calculated that to be, I think it was $971 million, almost $1 billion. We haven't discussed who gets allocated that. I think the JTIQ study group is now looking into cost allocation issues, so we did not dare to guess that or articulate that. Again, we purposely stayed away from cost allocation.
Right. I mean, I think it's also useful just to point out that I think 2 of those lines in JTIQ also showed up in the LRTP, the long range transmission plan that MISO just had approved. And so those lines are also showing up in their regional economic transmission planning process.
Yes,
And
that's part of
cost
the 10,
allocation is
that's
being
part of the 10 billion that they're going to be investing in.
right. Right, and so so that cost allocation piece is worked out, but yeah, for JTIQ, they're still figuring that out.
I think it's going to be a coordinated effort between the long range transmission planning and the JTIQ folks. But on the positive side, the JTIQ folks have decided that they're between MISO and SPP, they're going to repeat the study every 2 years. I think it's a good sign. It is a prime example of how coordinated planning can help. And coordination in the JTIQ is both for the period, but also for the different regions, because it's effectively doing an APS for SPP and MISO, or an interregional GI study, if you will put it that way.
Excellent. So we're nearing the top of the hour and we're going to need to wrap it up. So I'd like to thank Bruce and his team for the analysis and the value of proactiveness and generator interconnection. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out to everyone once the video file is posted. We'll answer the questions we didn't get to, get those posted. We very much appreciate your engagement. We look forward to seeing you again soon. The next webinar is on August 23rd with Bethany Frew and Yinong Sun from NREL on market design concepts for evolving power systems. NREL's got some really cool integrated modeling tools that they're going to present. And then on August 25th, Dev Milstein of LBNL, Hannes Pfeifenberger of Brattle, and Michael Goggin of Grid Strategies are going to discuss an empirical assessment of regional and interregional transmission congestion. They're going to show how a small number of periods of extreme conditions and high value play an outsized role in the value of transmission. And then finally, our fall technical workshop is going to be in Minneapolis on October 24th. Everything's open to everyone, so please feel free to register on the eSig website, esig.energy, as well as LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. So Bruce, I'd like to thank you one more time for a very timely and informative webinar. Thank everyone who participated in your interest, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.